talked a bit about identity and purpose, and I wanted to follow up that sermon with some, I guess we could call it instruction, or maybe some ideas to be helpful on that journey of rediscovering our identity and our purpose. What we just heard in Psalm 139 is a different kind of prayer from the Lord's Prayer. It's kind of an extended start to a conversation. It's a prayer that acknowledges something about who we are and who God is, but it doesn't cover everything. It covers a lot. And knowing that we have such a scientific bent in some of our members who like to know how science and religion merge, and knowing that we have some that are more in the mystical tradition, I've got a couple of different quotes for you this morning to kind of take into consideration as I talk about God and then talk about prayer. The first two are from the physicist Max Planck. All matter originates and exists only by virtue of a force which brings the particle of an atom to vibration and holds this most minute solar system of the atom together. We must assume behind this force the existence of a conscious and intelligent mind. This mind is the matrix of all matter. And then he goes on to say a bit later in his career, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything we talk about, everything we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. So that's the science side of, you might say, God. If we think of God as existing in a natural realm and trying to understand God through that natural realm. The next two quotes that I have for you are from a Sufi mystic. His name was Ibn Ata Allah, and he wrote these words in the Middle Ages. Remembrance of God is liberation from ignorance and forgetfulness, through the permanent presence of the heart with the truth. Let me read that again. Remembrance of God is liberation from ignorance and forgetfulness, through the permanent presence of the heart with the truth. And in his truth, it's capital T, one of the many names of God. And then he also goes on to say in a book called The Key to Salvation, anyone who meditates on the greatness and majesty and omnipotence of God Most High and on his signs in the heavens and the earth is one who remembers God. And the short version of his book, The Key to Salvation, is to remember God. So I think of God as consciousness, life, love, truth, spirit, the essence of all that exists. And we are in continuous conversation in that relationship with God. And I've said to you many times that I believe God is the most essential part of us. So looking at a question of identity, we might sometimes think that to know ourselves is a way to know God, but then also the reverse is true. To know God is a way of knowing ourselves. And in fact, I think that you have to come from both directions sometime to get to the wholeness of who we are as a human being. So while thinking about purpose, I thought about my job. What's my purpose? A pastor's job can be a lot of things, administratively and otherwise, but really to get kind of down to the ground level of what it means to do my job, I think it means that my purpose is to help you know yourselves and to know God. everything that we do here in some way or form has that ground that we're working from. So with that idea of God as who we might be speaking to, which includes speaking to ourselves, it kind of makes a little bit more sense what Soren Kierkegaard said in the quote in Reflection: "The function of prayer is not to influence God, but rather to change the nature of the one who prays." And to kind of go deeper into the idea of prayer and God, I like what Mahatma Gandhi says, that prayer is not asking. It's a longing of the soul. It is a daily admission of one's weakness. It is better in prayer to have a heart without words than words without heart. Probably one of the things that I'm wanting you to kind of get implicitly from what I'm saying, to make it more explicit, is that in our churches and in our catechisms and in the ways that we grew up in the Christian tradition, there were a lot of ways that prayer was described. There were a lot of different kinds. There was prayers of intercession, of petition, of consecration, of praise, of thanksgiving. But I don't think we really need a dictionary of prayer. I think we need something like what Gandhi is talking about, what Ibn Atta Allah is talking about, what even Max Planck is talking about. We need to think of what we're doing when we pray as a way of having a conversation, as a way of beginning an engagement with the world, an engagement with each other, an engagement with God that's like a dialogue that is continuous. And that when we are in that mode of remembering God in a continuous way, we're saved. And like I mentioned last week, probably the thing that we're most saved from is ourselves. So since it's a conversation, and since I'm not going to give you a dictionary of prayer, I want to tell you what I think is important about prayer. The first thing about prayer is being a beginner. At no point in time in this life are we ever going to know as much as who we're talking to. So we may as well start there and just be ready to receive knowledge and wisdom that comes in a different way to us, ready to receive and listen in another part of our prayer. The second thing that I think is important is to be real, to be here, and to be now. There's nothing worse than having an artificial prayer that has nothing to do about who you are and what's going on for you in the moment. Because who you are and what's going on with you in the moment is the most authentic thing that you could make a part of that conversation with God. It has to acknowledge how you feel. It has to acknowledge your condition in life. It has to acknowledge something about you and what's on your mind. Now, there's other things that we bring into prayer, but that's the part about bringing yourself into prayer. So we have to be a beginner. We have to be real. And then I think we have to be curious and have some anticipation about what might happen. We're participating in this conversation with God. We're even being active in our listening. We're being active in what we say. But we're not trying to put all the pieces together where we have this expectation that, quote, has to come true. It's more, I think, an attitude that says, I want to be open to however God may present God's being and God's presence to me. Or for us together to be present to what God might be presenting to us as a community. One of the things about prayer that I think is hard to understand is that it's kind of like the long-term game. It's not a place you go to always get short-term answers. So there's a bit of staying with it that's necessary. I heard someone describe one time that when you are a writer, that the best thing you can do is sit down each day with a dedicated amount of time to write and to go there and sit prepared no matter how you feel. Because if you're the kind of writer that sits and waits until you're inspired to write, chances are you're not going to be ready to write. So one of the things you do by going and sitting and taking that time each day to be prepared to write is that when inspiration comes, you're ready. You kind of earn your way into that place. And I think prayer and spirituality functions the same way. We don't always feel good about sitting down to pray or sitting down to meditate. We don't always feel inspired to go to worship or something like that. But when we take the time to hold that space in our lives and know that at the same time we are held by God, that we are held by love in that same space, then something can happen. And here are the things that I think happen after a bit of time. For some people, it happens right away. For some people, it takes a little bit longer. But one of the things that'll happen is you'll begin to get perspective on life, especially your own life. Because if you're talking from that real place, somewhere in there, you're going to have to look at yourself. You're going to have to ask yourself, how do I feel about some of the things that I'm doing in my life? How do I feel about some of the things that are happening to me? And then I believe the other result is that some of the things that are your true concerns will come into focus. We spend so much of our life reacting to the world where we get pulled out of ourselves that we don't even feel ourselves. We're not grounded in our own being. But when you pray, if you come from that authentic place, that grounded place in your life, then the things that are of your true concern will eventually come to the surface. You'll be better at your relationships. Another part of prayer and engaging in that relationship with God, I don't think that you can help but discover that when you get good at conversation with God, you're probably going to get good at conversation with everybody that you're in relationship with. And if we remember that when we use words like namaste, where we greet the God that is in the other person, the God in me that greets the God in you, then we begin to understand that, whoa, prayer isn't just this time when I'm sitting down talking to God, but this is potentially a part of every conversation that I have as a human being. So prayer is a path, in a way. We're all on that path in some way or some form. And ultimately, on that path, we find out who we are. And that is one of the questions that I asked last week. Who are we? So what I'm suggesting to you is that if we're going to answer those questions about who we are and what our purpose is, there are two components of our life that are essential to remember. Just like the Sufi master said about remembering God and having prayer. Now, I think that when you're on this path, when you discover your purpose, you kind of merge with your path. This is another thing that happens over a long period of time. You begin to see that who you are and what you do are very intimately joined together. Now, sometimes what you do is not your identity. We have to remember that we might be a doctor, we might be a lawyer, but that identity part that we're looking for is not so much what we do. What we do is important, but when that most essential part of who we are is connected with what we do, that's where we intersect with our purpose. Now, I've just given you kind of a formula, and you've heard this formula before, and we have a model for understanding this formula. And I know you know who that is. That model for understanding that formula is Jesus Christ. I just talked to you about a way. I just talked to you about truth, who you are, how your purpose is connected together, and how those have to have an impact on our life. And so what did Jesus say? I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. I find that curious and interesting because I didn't start to go there when I started to write my sermon. But I ended up there because I think that when we think of Jesus, we might think of him as the Son of God, or we might think of him as just a prophet. I mean, we have such a wide range of belief in our church. But I think that he addresses all of those things with that statement, because in a way, anybody that is trying to understand who they are, what they're doing, and where they're going with their life, that's kind of like a magic intersection for a person, where you kind of merge with your path in the world, where you understand that you can be owned by the truth. Remember, I said we don't ever own the truth. The truth owns us. And then life in God is part of that same process. So I hope that as we look at our purpose and our identity in the weeks ahead, that we don't lose sight of these parts of who we are, and that we remember God. Amen. Our hymn is